Hey, Brian.
Hey, how you doing, sir?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing good.
Good. I feel like today we can pick up kind of exactly where we left off in the last episode because we kind of left a couple of questions hanging. You had referenced us forming a global brain, and I've read some science fiction books that made that out to be not such a great thing. Um, and now I'm reminded of the Matrix also, which is a different kind of global brain, maybe. And so I was curious to kind of talk more about, you know, filling in the what we mean by global brain or global
Right,
mind a little more, because there's actually a lot to that and a lot of assumptions baked into that. And then we also touched on Marshall McLuhan again at the end of the last episode, and I thought it might be good to bring him back in and talk a little more about maybe how he would be seeing the current goings on, or something like that.
right.
So, global brain.
Yeah. Well, when I mentioned that, I probably was thinking of McLuhan and thinking of, you know, uh McLuhan talked about media as the extensions of mankind. That they're actually extensions of our sensibilities. Microscopes help us see smaller, and telescopes help us see farther, and automobiles help us move faster, and airplanes help us move even faster, and calculators help us count, and but they're all basically these media are extensions of ourselves. And I think it's interesting if we go back to the very beginning of the internet. The idea was for scientific brainiacs at one university to be able to share research and papers and their highfalutin thoughts to one another, with the idea that facilitating this exchange would facilitate the fruits of discourse which it facilitated, right? Which the medium facilitated. So, and then what I think about when I mentioned uh, in our last episode, I think I mentioned the printing press. And I made reference to Dostoevsky getting captured with a printing press when he was young and almost getting shot. Well, Marshall McLuhan wrote an entire book called the Gutenberg Galaxy. And it was basically about the Gutenberg revolution, the revolution of the printing press. And so, for example, one of the things that people don't typically realize today, they're just kind of fun facts, until the printing press, spelling and punctuation were not standardized. Reading and writing was a job, and you were a scribe, which meant that you
Fun fact: my
uh,
last name Soifer means scribe.
exactly, yeah. And so that was actually very significant because most people couldn't unlock that secret code of scribbles. And there are all these great stories within some of the old kung fu legends, and I think they were made into movies. And it's often about a quest for the scroll. Or in one story, the guy cracks open the old statue that he finds in the old temple when he was ducking in to get shelter from a storm, and then the scroll has all the secrets, right? But these scrolls, what they always have to do in most of these stories is they have to take the scroll to the Buddhist monk, because he's the one that has the skills of reading and writing because of his his necessity to work with sutras. But the average person doesn't have time for that. There's crops to plant, dude. So with the coming of the Gutenberg revolution, all of a sudden, you got the potential for everybody to unlock this secret code. And that meant that you could have all sorts of unauthorized communications, which was the case with Dostoevsky. And that meant that you had to have, then there become people who approve those communications and people don't approve those communications, just like Dostoevsky's problem when he got caught with the printing press. And now we are seeing places where authorities are coming down on people for things they printed, in air quotes, on the interwebs. So there are certain parallels there, and I think that, the obvious parallels are the follow the laws of foreseen consequences. And I think we can always see those with hindsight, because those are the things that shaked out that later on you can go, oh yeah, well, of course, you know. But then, the things that we can't see that are interesting are all the unforeseen consequences on the psychodynamic level. Like what happened to collective consciousness once you got a literacy rate up to a certain level? And although I understand now it's coming back down. So,
A lot of things coming back
a
down.
lot of things come back down.
Longevity, yeah.
Yep.
So there are two threads that I want to tug on here a little bit.
Mhm.
One is you described media as extensions of ourselves, but bringing in the global brain idea implies that extensions of ourselves includes toward one another as
Right.
opposed to extensions of each of us individually. And I think there's a big assumption in there that is worth unfolding. The
Literally
other
another
thread,
dimension of the encounter with the other.
hold that thought,
Yeah.
because the other thread is the psychodynamics and the unforeseen consequences. I just kind of blanketly attribute to the degree to which human beings are still individually dealing with shadow material and potentially collectively dealing with shadow material. They're projecting their unowned garbage out through all of these extensions, everything from cars to printing presses to social media. And I'll put AI in the category of new media also, since we're
Yeah.
describing media so broadly. So,
Well, see, this is something that's always happened, is the man makes the tool changes the man, then the man changes the tool, then the tool changes the man, and they go back and forth, probably from banging rocks together to get, which has some takes a knack. So
hence
so,
the name.
but I think that is the nature of tools, and I've thought this about AI. You know, people nowadays, a lot of people don't work with tools, and what if you don't work with tools, you make the assumption that you just grab up a tool and use it. And if you come from the world of using tools, there's a couple fun things that you need to you would realize immediately. And one is that we always assume the tools are just to fix stuff, to make stuff, to do all that, and so we don't realize the incredible destructive potential of tools. Uh, that's what I've said before. When I make a piece, say a piece of furniture or something, not only did I create it out of the raw materials, but I also protected it from destruction by the very forces and tools that I used to create it with. And in woodworking, the obvious example is saws, right? Which in the flash of an eye can go badly wrong. And but that potential exists, I think, everywhere. So one of the things that like for example, working in the cabinet shop, I would occasionally rip full sheets of plywood on a big table saw that's got many, many horses pushing it. That's a job that you don't give to a day one woodworker. Like their tools have a progressive curriculum. Not all tools are day one tools. Like some tools, you really got to build a skill set. And a lot of those tools you apprentice before you're the one that they let hold the handle on the thing. You know, you just don't let anybody just jump into a backhoe. And that's a simple, common example. But tools have skill set curves. And when we invent new tools, a lot of times when we invent a new tool, we don't even know what it's good for. Somebody else has to come along and invent a use for it. But in all those cases, we're just winging it. We don't know. there are no masters of the application of that tool if it's new. And so that means that we just gotta work it out. Think of Madame Curie. What an incredible tool radiation is in many ways, and took her right out, and there's a kind of a story there. Uh, so yeah, there's this interesting, that's one of the things that they have found that animals do it, but that's one of these unique things that seem to be about humans is that we have this instinct to make tools.
Can we connect that back up to this? I hadn't thought before that not only are we projecting our shadow through the tool, but I hadn't thought of it as the tool might be revealing to us elements of the shadow that we can then integrate, and there might be this interrelationship with tools or media, right? We're kind of using both of those
Mhm.
terms very broadly, where there's a self-reflexive in a good way element to that. I don't know if
Yeah.
I agree with that or not, but it's kind of an interesting idea, I think.
Well, I think that one of the things about tools, and this is intellectual tools as well as actual tools, and that is that their use tends to bring you to a focus around certain details and thereby not around certain other details, uh, because tools are use specific.
So they're almost refiners of semantic reality, the way language is.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. Is that a tool does actually push out your model, your cognitive model, which is a pattern of getting what you want out of interacting with reality, right? Now maybe it's working a lathe, right? Yeah, the spinning thing that, don't wear a necktie when you're doing the lathe stuff, okay? Uh
Maybe just don't wear a necktie in general.
yeah, I think there might be a a reducible general principle there, yes. But especially yeah, and, so it has to do with, unlocking the potential of a tool has to do with respecting its destructive potential, as well as, to some degree, modifying yourself to it. An example of that with AI might be you have to learn how to prompt it. Even though it doesn't seem like we're doing anything, different people will get different results with the same tool. And that tells you that there's something going on with tool usage, and that if we think of these as extensions of ourself, they literally are extending our cognitive models. Or we called it in episode one. Folks now who've listened to a lot of our episodes know that this idea of a semantic world carries a lot of weight. That is, we refer to it a lot, and it kind of is a mechanical piece in the understanding of the how things work. And this idea first came up with Husserl in phenomenology, the father of phenomenology, and he called that the Lebenswelt, which is the life world, is how we translate that. And he said all the same things about it pretty much that we've said about the semantic world. And he called it the Lebenswelt. And it has all those things that have all those ineffable qualities that are kind of in our cognitive model that pure science can't just pull out, all those levels of meaning. So yeah, I would say that tools and extensions of ourselves. I think we saw it with television was one of the first times, or radio maybe before that. And these are all communication based. And I wanted to, because they're communication based, this is a perfect time for me to drop in again another nugget. We spoke in our two conversations with Dr. Claudia. We talked about rhetoric and dialectic. We talked about how they're different, but we didn't really explore some of the details of how they're different. In one of the ways, the idea of rhetoric is that an orator is typically considered a great rhetorician. I suppose authors could be put into that category often, but the idea is they are it's a monologue There's nobody answering or asking. There's no external thing that's necessarily going to happen that's going to prompt a change in the delivery of that rhetorical message. And so what that means is that rhetoric literally doesn't have to answer to anybody, right? It's only after the fact. And as a result, rhetoric includes emotional appeals. Rhetoric includes cherry picking the facts that you want to provide. Anything that an attorney might do or say in front of a jury and not just get thrown out for is probably safely in the bounds of rhetoric. Uh, the thing that pushes it beyond rhetoric is the fact that there's the other side there that now can say, but wait, there are these other facts, right? But a pure rhetorician is like a politician speaking to a crowd. There isn't necessarily that counterpoint. There's just point, and all things are fair game, right? Like in the rhetorical world, you can say anything, right? These people murder puppies, right? If you want, if that's going to serve your rhetorical point. That's very different than the dialectical world where this counterpoint, this interplay, where premises can be challenged and questioned, as well as whole other models of the topic can be introduced. And so they're fundamentally different. And a lot of the media that we're surrounded with is just really hyped up rhetoric. And, so that's what we're seeing now with this hyper novelty. The question, that we've asked with the podcast is, can dialectic find a new place, a new voice, a new chorus of voices with this special quality that dialectic wants to have, that's not specifically debate, but that's actually, as Plato would say it, the mutual uncovering of truth. Or as Gadamer would say, this fusion of our horizons by building a bridge through language that connects our Husserlian Liebenwelts, right? Or our semantic worlds, for us to find, what later they called a we relationship. For us to build that bridge, somehow something new has to occur in our interaction. And rhetoric can't do that.
Yeah, I'm curious. I guess about a couple things. One is a few episodes ago we proposed that without language, a cognitive model wouldn't be possible. Now I'm wondering if without the other, right? Without discourse or some level of merging of horizons, um, a cognitive model might not even be possible. Or
That
what would it
argument has
mean?
been made.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I imagine it has. And then I'm also remembering, just kind of like to give an example of how media or communication or a tool through its use changes our cognitive model. I worked as an editor for a very technical science project, basically. Design and engineering of a district energy system
Mhm.
for Santa Fe. So I was the project manager, but I was editing the engineering reports that were written by a team of Austrian engineers. So they were writing them, but I had to put it in understandable English. And the first one that I edited, I sent to the boss for review, and I thought I was a pretty good editor, and he said, "There's no way this meets the standard. I'm going to stay up all night and do it myself, and I don't even know if I can give you the next one." And I said, "No, give me another try." So he gave me the next one, and I went through, I think it was about 120 pages, that chapter of the engineering report, sentence by sentence, making sure that each sentence was exactly as clear as possible in the context of all the other sentences being exactly as clear as possible. It took me about 10 times as long as the first iteration had, and it changed how I write and it changed how I think and ask questions just by doing that discipline for, a week or week and a half or whatever it was, of just having every sentence mean exactly what it needed to mean. So I can see how tools shape us. And having the tool didn't, but using the tool did, right?
Right,
Like you were
right.
saying.
Mhm. Yep.
But yeah, say maybe you can say more about, do we need the other in order to have a cognitive model or a semantic reality? And is that why ethics and discourse have become, respectively, the first philosophy and the most important medium, let's say?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that the argument that the other is necessary goes back to Husserl also. And I can't propose that I'm any kind of an expert on Husserl. In his years, he wrote over 45,000 pages. So, again, you need a few weekends for that. Um, but I know that because the parts that I've cherry picked out of Husserl had to do with inner subjectivity. And for him, inner subjectivity was fundamental to human consciousness and to what it is actually to be a human being, which I can't see any way that you don't end up where Levinas certainly ended up. If you really follow that down, it's if you follow that down morality. And because I think there's a thing, we haven't, the reason that some people may feel that we haven't made it super clear what is phenomenology. And let me assure you that that fog did not arise with us. Because as you go through the applications of phenomenologists following Husserl, his students, Heidegger's students, there's waves where it's like he gave a certain premise, and Husserl did that we ought to now. Husserl was a mathematician, and so his idea was that we ought phenomenology would literally be the study of phenomenon. But what it turns out to be is the study of the inside of our experience of phenomenon. It turns out to be very first person, and we always think of phenomenon necessarily as outside, but this idea that he wanted to call it a science, or other people have called it a science of sciences. And now,
That's more oblique. I guess the way I've been keeping track of it is, phenomenology being the study of how we experience, or yeah, what's important about how we experience. It might be a subset.
yeah, and you get into the phenomenologists, and they've got a whole thing about what you're after. Uh, and this gets into, without just plunging straight into the deep water, Husserl's student Heidegger, his piece was called "Being in Time," and his definition of what being is extremely detailed, and it's in German, it's das Sein, and Sein alone is being, but Dasein particularizes it. And so every human being is a Dasein. And this interaction between, and so for him, authenticity is sort of doing justice, intellectual justice to being with a capital B, which for him is stepping beyond the world of being, of beings, and of small b being. All the stuff, the 10,000 things, as the Taoists might say. But so for him, it's this idea is about being an authentic human. And uh, so my point is that phenomenology kind of becomes a tool that other people in later generations pick up and start applying to different things. And that's what we see in that wave after Heidegger, as well as Heidegger's generation. So you see people doing different things with phenomenology, going different places with it, and doing and having slightly different ideas about it. And that's why they define it differently in each iteration of this. And there are people that definitely took it, as we discussed before with Dr. Claudia, people that took it into psychology for sure. Particularly, I think I believe one of Husserl's teachers was a guy named Brentano, who was a psychologist. And being a mathematician, Husserl had this idea of a nice, complete, tidy, everything accounted for system. And I think everybody pretty much agrees that he didn't succeed in that. But the idea that he's looking for his formulation of the problem is not wrong. He got that. It's just his solution to it maybe took a few more Husserls to flesh out. And so but since that, for example, Husserl is and phenomenology is in a certain way, as we've spoken about, a kind of a reaction to and at the same time refinement of the Cartesian thing that we've spoken about before. Because the idea that Husserl wants to blow it up out of mere what he was arguing with, they called naturalism. And naturalism is what we would call now materialist, reductionist, materialist. Kind of everything can be explained by what's in front of us, by what nature has provided in front of us.
It's all math.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's all finite and chew upable. And but that part, an explanation that I heard of it that I thought was really good on YouTube, and I will try to dig out who who did it because I go through these things, but and put it in the show notes. And we like to use coffee cups as examples of things. You've seen me do it already here. Uh, and here in this case, he had two coffee cups, and he said, "Science. What is science going to tell us about this coffee cup? It's going to tell us that what it's made of. It's going to tell us all the phenomenological or the phenomenal aspects of it. We could measure the hardness of the material. We could measure its weight. We can measure its size. We could measure its displacement, its volume. That is." We can outline the colors and we can all the sensual stuff we can come up with. And so the guy says, "Okay, now I have this other cup. And this is the cup that I had tea in this morning. That's one of the cups in the kitchen." So he's got the two. I only have one, but he's got the two cups there. And he says, "So the science isn't really going to see much difference between these cups. Might see material different stuff like that." He says, "But this cup was my mother's. And because it was my mother's, I associate it with her. And it's fragile and the handle's broken off and been re-glued on so many times. And she passed away of cancer back in so and such a year. And so for me, this cup is about the fragility of life. It's about the times that we've had together. In other words, you'll recognize from our prior conversations what he's saying is that this object is anchored into his life world, or this his semantic world built up by his experience and his association and value, as opposed to quantity or fact. It's about value, and this human capacity to measure that is important because, again, a phenomenologist wants to look back at our own experience. Well, you can't look at a human experience and somehow look past the things that make up our lives, that create, the reason we do things. But somehow So he's gonna make the argument that you guys say you're so scientific because you wanna analyze all the measurable stuff, but how scientific is it if you don't start with the mechanism that you use to the method that you apply to come to understanding, and to do that, you have to drill into what is consciousness, which which is interesting because another thread that we've touched on before, I've never painted as the dichotomy that I think it is probably does serve it, and that is the difference between continental philosophy and American philosophy. So not that we've been here that long, but there is a distinction, and things have happened in that time. And there is a tendency in continental philosophy, I think it's fair to say, to want to do that inside first. If you don't know the inside, you don't have a way to know the outside. And the American approach seems to be more pragmatic. It says that the stuff on the outside isn't quite as slippery, maybe. We can talk about it and we can come to easier conclusions about it. And so you have schools like pragmatism and experimentalism and instrumentalism that are all these kind of more pragmatic, you know, tie down that hog or that horse, grab that pig. It's like 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 this rooted kind of pragmatic, how life really works idea, as opposed to going inside and it's willing to assume a lot of those things, I think. So there's some dichotomy there. Or you could say that there's been some dialectic between continental sensibilities and new world sensibilities, which is kind of an interesting aside that's been part of this story, actually, because a lot of these psychologists that really did start drilling down into the nature of experience, like William James, and these people that were influential in the formation of psychology, they were part of this philosophical conversation that happened through time. So
So I just want to make sure I understood your point, that the phenomenologists. I thought you were saying that they essentially fell into the same trap Descartes did by not differentiating the first je from the second je in I think, therefore I am. The first I from the second I. But then I think you said that when phenomenologists decided that in order to understand human experience, they had to ask what is consciousness, they
yeah,
transcended that Cartesian problem.
and you do see phenomenology applied to religion, to theology.
Hmm.
They're Christian phenomenologists and
Of course, they are
Levinas.
Christian phenomena, right? So why not?
And
Yeah.
that's the thing about this idea of it as a method that can sort of be applied. And though his works are voluminous, what that method exactly looks like, it becomes a little tricky, and I certainly am not qualified to do him justice. But it does have some, there are some ideas about it's of course very language based, and what are the things, uh again, the phenomenologists sort of are building on Kant, who had this idea of noumena and phenomena, and that's the same phenomena of phenomenologists. So this noumena idea is the idea of the thing in itself. So you have the people that'll say, "You'll never know what it's like." We talked about Nagel and the bat. What's it like to be a bat? You'll never know what it's like to be a bat. The noumena will never be touched. And then you have these other folks that are saying, "Well, but mind can do something. Mind can manifest empathy. Mind can sometimes transcend, so that there are things that will enable mind to get us closer to the thing in itself." So then, yeah, you have these guys come along and try to apply this every which way. Um, I do think that there is a distinction between psychology and phenomenology. in that while phenomenology is trying to understand the mind, it's not trying to do it from the outside, which is by measuring things and by counting things and by doing things that modern psychology does. It says you can't do any of that stuff correctly until you first do this theoretical work around consciousness and understanding. And then you'll know
So,
about your
yeah,
whether you're understanding or not.
I've seen Carl Jung referred to as a philosopher at, him being more a philosopher than a psychologist, maybe for that reason, that he was trying to understand consciousness from the inside, not trying to do a bunch of measurements, but, you know, kind of.
Right. And what was the name of his book? His not I mean, he wrote many books, but the one that was sort of like his sum it all up book was called Memories, Dreams, and Reflections.
Mhm.
All of them are in
First person.
that first person quadrant, and, where meaning lives, where personal and collective meaning lives.
Well, if we're talking Wilbur, I think collective meaning is in the other internal quadrant, right? The internal collective one that he calls culture, I think.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, he makes the distinction between collective and within this Lebenswelt, there's a lot of different aspects that we could tease out of it, right? Uh, Values is a big one uh, because those are going to be driven from our personal experience, as well as our cultural download, as well as our family, which sits somewhere in between personal and cultural.
I think Jonathan Haidt also proposes that we come in with a certain blueprint for values too.
That's that a priori idea
Yeah.
that we've talked about.
Yeah, he's got a whole thing about they're essentially I think he has, I want to say, six sliders of, I care more about this than that, or care more about that than this, and that's kind of the blueprint. We can dig it up and put it in the show notes. He's got a TED talk about it.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
Um, so I'm wanting to circle all the way back to the question of a global brain, because I think we've kind of proposed, and this might be a priori also, maybe it's experiential, that an objective of the evolution of consciousness is some degree of merging. And I think that's like a pretty common religious or spiritual idea that we have forgotten the extent to which we're all interconnected, and we're interconnected with the universe, and the universe is a place out of which we cannot fall. And we're spending our lives trying to remember as much as possible. And by doing so, we're reintegrating with the other. I don't know how much that's a philosophical idea, right? Because it really seems to fall more in the kind of spiritual realm. Um, but when you think of a global mind, I assume you're thinking of something like that happening. And then we introduced into that, well, and we're all doing that not only through the vehicle of our psyche, but through all of these extensions to our psyche that are tools, media, forms of communication, etc. And so those are kind of the scaffolding or the matrix for a collective mind to become more integrated. I'm wondering if what I'm describing tracks with your model of it. And then I'm wondering if you have an idea of, well, what does that look like in 100 years or 1,000 years or 5,000 years,
Yeah,
given
yeah.
some trajectory?
Well, when we spoke about how do you enrich your experience base that is the raw matter of your life world, of your semantic world, how do you enrich that in a way that broadens your perspective? I think the phenomenologist might say that we can, to some degree, through reflection, lose our small perspective and somewhat wiggle that nail up to get a bigger perspective if we use reason introspectively to do that. And so, I mean, the idea of the expansion of consciousness has a couple dimensions to me personally. One is it's the breadth from which I draw the raw material to digest into my life world. That is, how far a reach can I get? But the other one is almost like, so that might be like, how big is my hard drive? Or how fast is my download to the web? But the other one is my own personal processing capacity. And I know that my experience, and this is often people's experience when reading certain philosophers, you realize that these dudes are palming much bigger intellectual basketballs than your fingers really enable you to grasp. And we have this combination conversation about how meaning grows. Well, it isn't just the growth of the meaning, it's the growth of our capacity to hold that meaning. So, as extensions of man, these media become ways for us to grow those fingers, that so that we can grasp, but it also has become, and I think we're learning about it, the environment that trains the human how to use those capacities. And we're at the beginning of that, and things are moving fast, and that's why people think it's just wreckage. Everybody's just moving fast and breaking things. But there's a process that's going on that's just accelerated. And so, from a McLuhan view, this isn't just the information that it brings to me. It's the massage, right? It's the way that it alters my experience of reality. And we've talked about some of those dimensions, the fact that we can have this conversation, the fact that other people can listen to it later and then they can tell us, oh, you're full of shit about this or that. Uh, but also, we saw it in the connection with Africa, and we saw it with, people caring about how other people's lives worked out. So we saw sharing of meaning, and we see the compost turning fecundity of the churning of the collective narrative that has just exploded because there's no gatekeepers anymore, right? There's no editors saying, we can't say that. Or, if we say that, then they'll think this. Well, it's like now the lid's off everything, right? And there's arguments on both sides of there's inevitability to it. But it's like a version of the question: how much do you let your kid run around outside when they're growing up, knowing that there's cactuses and other things that could happen, and yet knowing that they actually need a jab here and there to give them the capacity that they need. Well, I think that on the modern level with the internet, the same exact thing exists. There's people that are going to try to, if we think about this as intentionality, because all these extensions of humankind, they require my intentionality as the seed to get it going, right? I've gotta wanna stick the to see the thing, to stick the telescope up to my eye and point it in this direction. I have to tune the radio to the station that I want, whether I want jazz or I want rock and roll. I need to my intentionality leads me, but there are traps for my intentionality, right? Because my intentionality and my attention, my intention and my attention are related in a curious way. So I can be going, whoop, 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 and I'm gonna learn about this particular thing that I have an interest for. Whoa, she's hot. Well, this was a honeypot for my attention. And then this media is actually going to learn that, he might also be interested in hunting knives if we put those out there, because once he looked at a hunting knife for a few more nanoseconds than this or that, so there's so this media is making like they said, here's a leap. They used to talk about you were in the Shaolin temple until you could escape, right? And by escape, you had to go through a test. And to pass the test, there were a bunch of different, but one of them was a hall that you had to go through, and the hall was a set of booby traps. And you had to go through and make it through to come out at the other end. And then in the famous TV series, you see once he's finally made it through all those trials, he picks up the thing, and that burns the image of the tiger and the dragon into his forearms, and then now he's out into the temple, right? So I almost think of the internet as a machine like that room in the temple that has all these booby traps and all these things that will train your intentionality. And yeah, you want to know what? Most people don't make it through that room. And sadly, we know about Shaolin Kung Fu because of a very small number of people that actually didn't pass the test. But instead of keeping trying, they just ran away. And then a warlord came in and killed everybody else. So we don't really have passed on the highest level dudes. Now there's lineages that are going to argue, so, oh no, our lineages was the high, and I don't know. Who
Darwin
knows?
might argue too.
Pardon?
Darwin might argue too.
And then there's that, right? And time and yeah. But so these at some point our obstacles become the things that hone our capacities. Those that's where we get the callus. That's where we learn how to push ourselves past it, because this obstacle is putting it to us. So I do kind of feel like this new modern world of hyper novelty is in its own way like that kung fu hall of traps and triggers and delusions and illusions, but it's a training field. And with the right tools and with the right focus, eventually you will be able to snatch the pebbles from the master's hand, and then you'll probably make it out the other end.
Or in this case, I think you're proposing that we're training for knowing the other.
We're doing our hermeneutic push-ups, yeah, and developing, because it's all about not misunderstanding, right? That's really the challenge now, and that's going to be the challenge of the future, is not misunderstanding. Because we got a lot of data flying at us. We got to like like spears, right? Where you shooting the arrows at them. We got to be able to sort through it. And we know that we're not always. Remember, I told you about the three levels of learning: learning when they're trying to teach you, learning when they couldn't care one way or the other, and learning when they're trying to not teach you. So, learning in spite of people's throwing things in your pathway, and those are like the three different levels of refinement to understanding. So
And we're doing all three at once, of course.
on a good day.
Well, yeah, we're invited to do all three at once.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, and what do you think McLuhan would make of AI? More or less the same thing he made of radio in Africa, or what do you think he'd be
Well,
saying?
I think that before you get to AI with McLuhan, one of the interesting things that McLuhan came up with, I mean, came up with a bazillion interesting things. Everybody should be like, you got to read Understanding Media if you're going to live in this hyper mediated world. The details will be in the show notes, right? This is a book that was so groundbreaking that the editor said, no, there's too much new stuff in this book. We can only handle 10% new stuff. You got like 90% new stuff in here. That's why it's still relevant today. It might be even more relevant today than it was when the guy wrote it. So, one of his principles is hot and cold. So, the the faster the media downloads you information, the hotter it is. So a book, it depends to a little degree on how fast you read, but a book is a pretty cold medium. Whereas, uh, I'm trying to think of something that's, I think the best
Think of
audiovisual example.
When MTV happened in the late '80s, and suddenly it was all about quick cuts.
MTV did it hugely, and if you
Yeah.
wanna just look in the audiovisual track, go back to The Honeymooners, and you can do this on YouTube. And it's like they're on a stage, and the camera cuts every camera cut has a long period before the next camera cut by what we're used to. But then you see MTV, and now there's nobody staying in one place for a second. A second is like forever. Are you kidding? You're in the car. There's the girl. It's the rain, and there's the guy, and now there's him, and then there's the bridge, and then you go, da, 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 and does she love him? She's not love him. Da, 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 and then boom, 3.5 minutes. You just got downloaded, and with McLuhan, the idea was you're not getting all the information, so you have to provide what's missing, and he called that striving for closure. So
Is that not also totalizing?
Well, or it's taking that piece and putting it in association, defining it by context. And so it's really relies on context a lot. And so my grandma, who was born in the year 1900, she could watch the honeymooners just fine. And it was like cool and it was engaging and she followed the story and the plot line and everything perfect. Uh, she couldn't do MTV. Now, she didn't live until the days of the MTV, but, Lawrence Welk, she was all over that shit. But as different as Lawrence Welk is to God Save the Queen, today's rock and roll reference by the Sex Pistols, like the medium changed. And the medium, according to McLuhan, isn't just the message, the medium is the massage, which was another book that he wrote, right? But that was his idea. The medium is the message, not just what the content that the medium is carrying.
That one's less of a book, as I recall, and more of a collage.
Yeah, yeah. It was redefining the medium of book. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And massaging you with the book as much as containing literal information. And but so with this idea of hotness and coldness, MTV is much hotter than the honeymooners, Jackie Gleason, right? Uh, well, whenever you hybridize two media, the resulting offspring, the synthesis, is hotter than either of the progenitor contributors. So, for example, again, MTV. MTV took radio and it took television and it basically made them have a love child, and that was MTV. So it was all about the pace of the radio, but complete with the visual download that accompanied it. And it was a hotter medium as a result. And one of the ways we know is because younger people were into it. Because there is this just like there is a thread of the increase of dissonance through the history of music, from Gregorian chant to, again, the Sex Pistols. uh,
I mean, it gets a lot more dissonant than that, but yeah.
but I mean, but that general direction through time, there is the same idea that we're getting the ability to process more input, get more data through our media with each succeeding generation. That's why a 14-year-old kid can do shit on your cell phone that you didn't realize you could do because he's in a different stage of this cultural progression, right? So, uh, this kind of thing happens so organically and so pervasively that I think the cultural leaders who think they can steer and control this, I think they're up against the unforeseen consequence rule. And they're also up against the see, if you believe in a mechanistic reductionist universe where everything is just ping pong balls and everything is explained by what you can see or measure with an instrument, then you don't have the worldview that there's something from the level of meaning that is manifesting through the material, as in through the human race. So, so if you have that view, then you might easily say, well, there's this thing that's happening through the human race that no human is going to control or influence, no matter how many subscribers they have. That this is just what wants to happen because we carry this meaning within us. That's why I'm so interested in a priori intuitions, a priori sensibilities, or and I talked about a priori intuitions, and I should mention because we did do an episode about intuitions, and philosophers, they use the words that all the rest of us use, but they don't always use them the same way that we do. And in the philosophical world, intuition doesn't always mean what we mean in common parlance. And that is, it doesn't mean necessarily knowing what's going to happen in the future. Intuition tends to mean things that we know immediately without a reasoning process. And so it makes it a much more commonplace idea that we have an intuition about things that we don't need to think about. And so that's where that it's a bigger category than the common parlance of knowing the future, which we sort of get out of, and I know that realizations that I've had often in ceremonies, it was stringing up actual experiences or the meaning nuggets from those actual experiences and seeing a wholeness in them that I hadn't seen before. But it was that's why it was an aha, because I didn't have to go through a reasoning process. I just saw or experienced, saw with my mind's eye, if you will. So that's this idea of a quality of intuitional knowledge that has some flavor of a priori, which is to say beforehand, prior knowledge somehow.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common experience in ceremonies or with psychedelics in general. Because you see it in, movie representation or cartoon representation of somebody going on an accidental peyote trip. I'm thinking of the Simpsons movie, I think,
Oh, okay.
where like you just start seeing fractals and the interconnectedness of all things, and that's like normal.
Right.
And yeah, and particular particularities within that can have particular meaning, right, for each of us, right? Like seeing something about our upbringing and something about how we are with our kids and something about how we are with our partner, and
Yep.
seeing connections there, right, that
Right.
are specific
It
to us.
stirs the world of meaning
Yeah.
and connections and the what are connections but a coherence that we didn't get. And then so there's a wholeness to this somehow, a
Yeah,
connectedness to this.
we're just tuning the meter.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Good. Well, maybe that's a good stopping point for today. And I know we'll be coming back to Global Mind and to McLuhan. So lots more to unpack, I'm sure. But yeah, I hope the rest of the week warms up for you out in New Mexico.
I trust it shall, and
Yeah.
same for you.
Yeah, it's warmer already here in Philly. Last couple days were cold, but it was like 50s today, and I think I was out in a t-shirt briefly. So my favorite time of year is upon us.
Yeah, yeah. No, we have the New Mexico thing going on where yesterday I was in the biggest haboob that I've ever been in. Now, some of you might wonder what exactly is a haboob. And no, this is nothing you will find on Pornhub. A haboob is actually a ferocious, tempestuous wind that comes usually along with a sandstorm. And it actually was so intense. It was blowing from west to east as I was going in the van. You can imagine it felt like I was in a World War II bomber flying over Berlin or something. And with all the tumbleweeds blowing in herds across the road. It was like trouble with tribbles, right? And and there was actually a point where there was so much dust in the air that I momentarily lost sight of the car ahead of me that we're talking was definitely, half a football field in front, something like that. And it was definitely one of the biggest haboobs that I have experienced, so that's our fun Arab word for
Yeah.
today.
I'm familiar with hamsin, which is a Arabic word for a sandstorm. I'm curious what the difference is between those. I'll go look that up and maybe
Yeah.
report back.
I think hob is wind, and so I thought I saw somewhere that haboob was blown. Something that was blown, so but I'll be interested in what you come up with.
Yeah.
Bueno.
Cool. Take care of yourself, Brian.
You do the same. Have a good one, everybody.